I'm Sarah Angel, and I am the founding executive director of the Art Canada Institute. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Thank you for joining me for the launch of Yves Gaucher, Life and Work by Dr. Roald Nasgaard. We're here for an amazing celebration this evening. The book went live this morning, and it is burning up the internet in danger of crashing the ACI site. In 1965, with his series of paintings, Square Dances, Yves Gaucher entered fully formed into the world of hard-edged, chromatic, abstract art. And along with the stripe paintings of Guido Molinari and the target paintings of Claude Toussaint, he essentially defined a style of art that Montreal became known for in the 1960s. The mid to late 60s were banner years for Gaucher, the time when he became a star, when his career took off. In 1965, he participated in numerous exhibitions throughout the United States devoted to optical art. In 1966, along with Sora Letrog and Alex Colville, he represented Canada at the 33rd Venice Biennale. And the same year, he had his second solo exhibition at the Martha Jackson Gallery in New York City. Gaucher's culminating work of the 60s was a series of paintings, gray on gray paintings, that he executed between 1967 and 1969. When 3 of them were exhibited in Scotland in 1968, the British critic and curator Brian Robertson had this to say. He said that Gaucher was a dazzling artist who, quote, are you ready for this? Who, quote, made what are possibly the most beautiful, original, and awe-inspiring paintings ever seen anywhere since the advent of Pollock and Rothko. Now, although Gaucher's trajectory, his career trajectory, seems completely remarkable, and his gain in international acceptance and celebrity seems very fluid and easy, in fact, it wasn't like that, as we're going to hear tonight. When Gaucher was in his late teens, he was at a real crossroads. He was unsure of his life, his artistic ambitions, and how to find his path. And then things changed for him in 1951 when he had a conversation with Arthur Lismer at the Montreal Museum of Arts. And he went there because Arthur Lismer, as some of you in the room will know, was a former member of the Group of Seven, a founding member, but he was also an extraordinary advocate for Canadian art history and for Canadian art education, and was esteemed in this position. And although many of Lismer's works seem quite gentle, like this painting, and have a pastoral quality, he in fact was a fairly tough guy. And as Gaucher later explained, he put serious questions into my head. That's what Gaucher said. I think looking there, Lismer does look a little tough, like he could be. Anyhow, and what Lismer said to Gaucher was this. He said, you have a choice. There are 2 paths that you can go down. And he asked Gaucher, do you want to be reassured throughout your life? Or are you ready to make sacrifices? And it wasn't too long after that Gaucher quit his day job, began taking art courses, and formed a singular, unique path to becoming one of Canada's most important abstract artists. Now tonight, you're going to hear a great discussion about Gaucher. We'll get into his work, into his history. But before I introduce you to this evening's guests, Dr. Roald Nasgaard and Adam Welsh, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about the Art Canada Institute. As the Art Canada Institute states proudly on our webpage, our goal is to make Canadian art history a contemporary conversation. Like Arthur Lismer, we are advocates of education for Canadian art history. We believe that the stories, the images, the histories of those who have defined the country's visual culture need to be known, not only here, but around the world. We believe that in documenting our history, we are laying the groundwork for generations to come of artists, of curators, of educators, and art lovers. The Art Canada Institute is the only organization in Canada that is exclusively devoted to the creation of expert-authored original content on Canadian art history and its promotion to a global audience. We are the country's only initiative devoted to creating a library of books on the country's most important artists. Dr. Nasgaard is among the country's most accomplished and influential experts on Canadian art. He is an award-winning author, a curator, and an officer of the Order of Canada. Dr. Nasgaard served as Curator of Contemporary Art and Chief Curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario from 1974 until 1993. There, his exhibitions included solo shows for Canadian artists including Yves Gaucher, Jerry Kennedy, and Ron Martin. He also curated the work of many international artists, including the first Gerhard Richter retrospective exhibition in North America. Recently, Dr. Nasgaard has curated groundbreaking exhibitions on both the Emeritus and the Plasticiens. Equally accomplished as an art writer, Dr. Nasgaard is the author of The Mystic North, as well as the recently released and much acclaimed works Abstract Painting in Canada, as well as the Emeritus Revolution, as well as the Plasticiens and beyond. This evening, joining myself, Roald Nasgaard in our discussion about Yves Gaucher, we have Adam Welsh, who I am delighted to have with us because earlier this afternoon, Adam sent me a text that said, no joke, even though it's April Fool's, my flight has been canceled. Adam was coming from Ottawa. But Adam, who I've had the privilege of getting to know through the Department of Art at the University of Toronto, where we are both doing our dissertations. From the moment I first met Adam, I thought, this is a person who is going to make it. And I looked at your text, Adam, and I thought, he'll be here. He's going to find a way. Hitchhiking, somehow. Adam is now the curator of modern Canadian art at the National Gallery of Canada. Prior to joining the National Gallery, which I would say is very, very lucky to have you, Adam held positions at the Whitney Museum of American Art and at the Justina Barnaky Gallery. Adam attended Columbia University in New York, where he received a master's degree in modern art and curatorial studies, and he is currently working toward his doctorate in art history at the University of Toronto, where he is investigating borderline research, art between Canada and the United States between 1965 and 1975. Adam has written extensively about Canadian art on artists including Jack Chambers, Jack Bush, and General Idea. He sits on the advisory committee for the Justina Barnaky Gallery, and he is a member of the board of directors for Art Metropole. So please join me in welcoming our guests. And with that, I'm going to turn to asking these gentlemen some questions about Yves Gaucher. Are you ready?
I hope so.
Okay, so my first question is actually for Roald, and it's this. It's that people tend to talk about Gaucher constantly as a rebel, somewhat of a rebel, mischievous, troublemaker, but still charming at the same time. And to give us a bit of a context, can you talk to us about where was his background? Why does he have this reputation? I heard he got kicked out of schools an awful lot. And how did he come to be an artist? Was it Lismer, or was I placing too much emphasis on that.
I find, can you hear me? Is this working? Somehow a little embarrassed trying to answer this question because there are people in the audience here who've known Yves a lot longer than I have. They're the godparents of at least one of his sons. So if I misspeak, I need to be corrected. But yeah, Yves was, I think you already talked about how, well, Yves was undoubtedly mischievous. There was always a mischievous glint in his eye. But he was always wonderful company. Yeah, you can see it even.
Yeah, you can.
You know, I know that's reading back into the photograph or not, but that's just fine because. But on the other hand, he took things very passionately, and I'd forgotten until I started working on this book again that he had at one point envisions becoming a priest. And somehow it surprised me a little because I had a hard time thinking of Yves in quite that way. It's not as if when we talked over dinner, as if we talked about religious matters. But then on the other hand, he did sort of take to things quite obsessively. And this could be not just about his art, it could be about building that Zen garden in Notre-Dame-de-Grâce in his backyard, or it could be about doing holidays at Club Med. I remember when he first started, he and Germaine started doing holidays at Club Med. This was the only place to go. And it was for several years. But I think you said, he was drifting for a long time until his very late teens. He was always drawing, apparently. But whether drawing was any more important than his interest in his dedication to jazz and doing jazz jam sessions and a number of other interests, but it certainly was as if Lismer called him to order and said, "Here, you better decide." And it was still a couple of years before he enrolled at the Montreal Museum School of Art, but by then, of course, he seems to have known what he wanted, and figured he knew better than any of the instructors or the course program, and simply declared, "I'm not taking these courses, they've got nothing to do with what I want to do," and he chose what he did, and apparently got expelled the first time around, but then there was a change of administration, he got let back in again, and he did what he wanted to do, because it's as if by that time he had a clear sight of where he wanted to go.
Now, I understand that he decided he wanted to become an artist and he wanted to become a painter. But then what's interesting to me is that he had this sort of decisive moment where he looked at the automatiste painting, specifically the work of Bourdois, and then he made up his mind that wasn't for him. Can you give a bit of context about, Adam, about so who were the automatistes and what did he not like?
Yeah. I mean, I think we often think about the automatistes as being defined by that signal moment, the drafting of the Revue Globale in 1948, and Bourdois and Riopelle as really being key figures in the emergence of that movement. And I think as art historians, too, we're biased in thinking about the automatistes as painters, exclusively oriented toward painting. And in fact, it's important to remember that there were poets involved, there were dancers, choreographers, there were critics that were crucial in the formation of that. And in many ways, it predates the publication of that very seminal document, the Revue Globale in '48. And I think it's useful maybe just to track back a little bit to 1941 to see how long this had been in the works before Gaucher really comes onto the scene and responds to the automatiste. And this is actually a chronology that I've cribbed from Roald's abstract painting in Canada. So I have to say, it's a constant companion in my office at the NGC. So in 1941, there's a kind of originary moment in this art competition where Paul-Émile Baudois gives first prize to painting to Pierre Gavreau. Pierre Gavreau is 18 years old at the time, Baudois significantly older. He's the elder of the automatiste movement. Most of them are quite junior by comparison. And crucially, it's Guy Viau, an important critic, later worked at the NGC, who made that introduction between Baudois and Gavreau and introduced this elder painter to this relatively young art student. And then over the course of the early 40s, we really see a kind of rapid development. 42, Bortois begins to host these salons where he talks with younger painters about surrealism, very importantly, and psychoanalysis, which I think are very important, a very important context for the emergence of automatiste painting. And then in 43, this great, important exhibition at Dominion Gallery, Exposition des Sagittaires, which doesn't include Bortois. It only includes artists under the age of 30, so he's excluded. But Bortois is shot through the exhibition. I mean, he's everywhere in that show. And it becomes clear, I think, in 46, when they have their first real automatist exhibition, that Bortois is a key figure in that. So there's a lead up to the publication of the Reflux Global in 48. And then, of course, by the time that Gaucher comes onto the scene, the automatist had been a kind of dominant force in Montreal painting for a considerable amount of time. I mean, he's really not coming to that until the late 50s. So I always think of it as a little bit of slaying the father, but I think that might be overly simplistic. Roald, I don't know if you would agree, but I think that it had been a dominant mode of expression in painting, a dominant vocabulary for painting for a long time. So when Gaucher comes to begin to work, I think it's something to react against.
Well, it's also worth remembering he was quite young. You
Yeah.
know, he was only in his late teens or very early 20s and had a pretty spotty, it's not as if he had a systematic art background or art history background at all. Montreal was a pretty confused place in the mid-50s. In 54, the automatistes kind of had their great apotheosis in an exhibition called La Matière Chante, or Matter Sings, which is a beautiful title. And then next year, all these geometric artists come along and say, you know, thumbs down on automatism.
And are these the geometric artists?
These are the geometric artists. First of all, the first plasticien, with Rodolphe de Repentigny as kind of the, I think, the real intellectual center of them. And then, and you look at the one on the right. It's on the right? No, on the left. It's a beautiful painting, but it's still a kind of still life. You know, it's still jugs and a gourd and whatever else, but radical for its time. And then within almost less than a year, Guido Molinari comes forth with the black and white painting, which is so simple that there really was no precedent for it in Montreal. And it wasn't about balancing one thing after another, doing a composition in the usual way. It was about how one moment the foreground is white and the black is background, one moment black is background and white is foreground. It's shifting when you see it in real life, of course, as opposed to we're looking at reproductions. In real life, it's a situation of constant irresolution.
But essentially, Gaucher is sort of taking a stance against
I think
different groups.
I think he's just too young.
Or
He's just too young because this is 1960, and it's kind of biomorphic, a painting like this, but it's textured and it's deliberately made as opposed to being spontaneously made. And it has a kind of body to it that's even and evenly textured. Now, what was interesting about this that we just saw Rodolphe de Repentigny's painting. His wife, Françoise de Repentigny, saw this and spoke about it being transcendent and being spiritual, which must have been kind of strange things to have said in the mid-1950s, at the beginning of abstraction. But in a way, it was kind of forecasting, I think, what became the essence of the future of Yves' work into the 70s and the 80s and then to the end. Françoise, by the way, is still alive and well and chipper and...
So Roald, I was wondering if I could ask you about, if we could just go back one slide, this was, as you said, I think quite a well-received painting, but Gaucher turns away from painting, really, for a significant amount of time, really, until 1964, and focuses instead on printmaking. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to to that shift, and what do you think motivated that turn to printmaking as a medium?
Well, the way he talked about automatism and its spontaneity was that it was very hard to control. That if you made one move, the painting changed, you had to make another one, you had to keep compensating. It was a continually fluid situation. And what drew him to printmaking was that it was slow and deliberate. And you could do it step by step. But interestingly enough, it wasn't like going back to being a more traditional artist. He did buy a textbook on traditional print techniques and, of course, learned what he needed to do. When he wanted to do something, he did it quite obsessively. But then started experimenting quite dramatically, very quickly, with prints like these, which are really quite large and which are kind of unusual in that these are not made of a single plate. These are made of 3 or 4 separate plates that he worked individually, and they are heavily embossed, they're thick, and there are no plate marks, which is also important. So you don't see them as an image. It's as if they are, it's almost pushing the prints towards being object-like. They're very physical.
And you mentioned in your text, actually, the fact that he would glue together 2 sheets of arch paper to achieve these super thick supports for his prints. So I think that the extreme level of embossing and impressions that he was making on these paper supports is attested to in that fact, right? He had to make up his own kind of...
Yeah, the paper was breaking on him, so he had to reinforce it in effect.
Yeah.
And of course, this is when he started showing internationally and winning international prizes for his printmaking.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, while he's gaining that notoriety, music is playing a really important part in his life, and he's involved with jam sessions with Guido Molinari at his gallery. Can you explain to us the role of music and where that fits in?
It's actually kind of interesting that he was a jazz performer, which involves improvisation. And yet he was so nervous about the improvisatory nature of automatist painting. So that's actually kind of curious. He also obviously must have known music much beyond jazz, because when he got to Paris in 1962, how would he come to search out Webern and a concert of Webern and Boulez and Barès? And why would it make such a significance to him? Why, when he particularly cites this Webern composition, which he kind of imagined, at least visually, as sending clusters of notes into the air where they would disperse. And that became, at least he attributes to that, whatever it was that took him out of doing those flagstone object things towards what he called the Weberns, where instead of the prints being about objects, they're about these lines and dots and squares. They're, as he called them later, they're kind of signals that operate rather than objects that insist on themselves. So they're about relationships between things now, rather than...
Is this work a translation of a musical score?
Well, that's hard to say, because Gaucher got very nervous about that, because he made those references. He talked about it. He called some of his works ragas and made these square dances. And then people started talking about them as somehow they were illustrations of music. And then he kind of backed away from it completely, because as far as he was concerned, music and visual art were separate, very separate languages with very individual languages. One, at most, it would have been a kind of analogy. There's no way he would accept, or I believe it's an illustration. But what kind of mattered was, in works like these, was the way that they don't resolve into, they may be geometric, and they're obviously organized on a grid, but they won't resolve in the eye into a way you can hold them. The eye has to keep moving and shifting. Clusters form here, then dissolve as you move along a bit, resolve, and back and forth again. So it's where the kind of, and maybe this is musical, the element of time, which of course was no-no if you were a Greenbergian critic, became a crucial aspect of his work.
And what's sort of fascinating is at the same time he's in Paris getting to know the atonal music, he sees a Rothko and is completely impressed by its transcendent quality. I was going to ask you, Adam, there's a lot going on in contemporary art during this period, and what are some of the things that are affecting Gaucher aside from music? What was he impacted by? Other schools of art?
I mean, I think that the encounter with Rothko, which actually happens before Paris, in fact, he sees the really important survey in 1961 that MoMA did of Rothko's work from 45 to 61. And then that same show travels to the Musée d'Art Moderne de Ville de Paris. He sees the show a second time in 1962. So he gets a double dose of Rothko. And I think that is significant. And interestingly, the show that was organized by the Museum of Modern Art was curated by Peter Sells and included, and I'm curious about this, 4 very early surrealist watercolors that Rothko made. And this was actually kind of highlighted in the press release for the exhibition. And I wonder if, Gaucher, seeing those early explorations into surrealism and then the eventual kind of trajectory that Rothko would take toward abex, but also kind of an indication of post-painterly abstraction and what was to come later in the 60s, had some resonance with him. But I'm not sure whether there's any, I don't know that part of Gaucher's practice well enough, but it's an interesting idea. I think seeing the Rothko show in Paris also impressed upon Gaucher the fact that New York and not Paris was the center of advanced art. When he went to Paris for the first time in 1962, he also saw work by Jasper Johns, he saw work by Morris Louis, and I think that confirmed in his mind that the exciting stuff was happening in New York and not in Paris. And then, Roald, I really like how you talk about Gaucher as being a French-speaking North American. I think that's an interesting idea.
That's how he came to define himself,
yeah,
as a consequence of his Paris experience.
Yeah.
And remember, it was easy to hop on the overnight train from Montreal to New York, so he was pretty well informed.
And he started going to New York really in 1959. He was going to go see art exhibitions, but also to hear jazz, right? I mean, yes. Kind of like Bush, there were 2 reasons to go to New York. But of course, as you suggest, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 60s art world, which I think bears just briefly sketching, because I won't be able to talk about all of it. But of course, the decline of abex into what Greenberg called 10th Street touch, this idea of a very mannered set of mannerisms, which is imitative of actual abex painting. So toward the end of the 50s, that trails off. 62, really the signal year for pop art, the emergence of Warhol, Lichtenstein, Rosenquist. And then, of course, op art's emergence and that kind of condensation point around the responsive eye and that important exhibition
and then
in
what's
MoMA.
going on in Quebec. And it
Yeah.
seems like the very things that Gaucher had sort of rejected earlier on, then he enters into the Plasticien movement. And
I mean, it's not so surprising that he should be uncomfortable about geometric painting in 1955-56. Once again, the artists that were emerging, who were practicing, after all, they had made their way towards that across several years of transforming their practice. So it's not really surprising Gaucher, who was just on the threshold of becoming an artist, should be receptive yet.
And so then he...
But then, yeah.
There's a line that you have in your book where you say he emerges sort of fully formed or fully born, and it is, I believe, with this work, as well as with the work that I'd mentioned in my introduction, with the square dance paintings. And what do you mean that he sort of arrives fully formed?
It's as if the prints, beginning with the Weber and the 3 or 4 that developed after that, I can't imagine why he suddenly decided, but whatever, it's as if they gave him the vocabulary where he could finally take up painting. Because after all, they were deliberate in the same way and planned in the same way as the prints were. And also, because of the embossment and they had that kind of objecthood to them already that he would stress in the paintings beginning with these, because the technique's fairly simple. It's rollers and masking tape, but it's on unprimed canvas. I mean, it's on primed canvas, so there's none of this post-painterly abstract New York staining or seeping into the canvas, which always gives you a kind of lyrical breathing space within. There's Greenbergian paintings are pictures that occur somewhere behind, whereas Gaucher, along with Molinari and Toussaint, operate in front of the picture plane. They are literal surfaces, and that set up these curious, of course, the way that he matches his very own, very peculiar personal color schemes, this retinol activity on the eye that happens between the viewer and the painting in the space in between.
And is that what critics really take note of? That what Roald's describing, that it's something that's different that's happening in Canada than the rest of the world?
Or you could say that was the problem with Montreal painting, that it didn't fit the criterion, the ruling criterion, which was Greenbergian postmodernist criticism. It didn't fit, so therefore, when the brief fashion for op art faded, then the work did not fit the paradigm.
I see. So it's sort of like this heyday that then.
Well, I think we see Greenberg's ideas around flatness and opticality are embodied in that post-painterly abstraction show, which traveled, of course, to the AGO in 1964, included Jack Bush. And you're absolutely right that not only the use of rollers, but the idea that the finish was so completely opposed to what Greenberg was advocating for in the work of Frankenthaler. We can think of her stained paintings, of Noland, of even Olitsky. So I think, and this is really indicated by the fact that his second, you mentioned in your intro that he has an exhibition in '65 at Martha Jackson Gallery. That's his second show in a very prestigious New York gallery. It's also his last show, because Martha Jackson feels, and Roald, you talk about this, that he just isn't, he's out of step with New York painting. He's out of step with kind of larger tendencies in international art. So I think that that speaks to the kind of pervasiveness of that Greenbergian model of post-painterly abstraction, and the fact that the Plasticien didn't, once op art faded away, they didn't really have a lot of traction internationally. This show, Canada 101, the Venice Biennale, those were organized by Canadian institutions, by Canadian curators, and sent abroad. It wasn't as if foreign curators were coming and selecting the work. So I think that's an interesting.
But then it was the Gray paintings that received that amazing quotation that I read out about him being, the second coming after Pollock and Rothko. But yet it seemed like there really was a moment in time, a peak of his career, although he would have in his career quite a long career throughout the 70s, 80s, where we start to see work, his work evolves, goes from darker palette to lighter palette. What is he thinking about in that later decade of his life?
Well, I think what is kind of remarkable, even as I think that, of course, the Gray paintings were a major achievement. Everything that Brian Robertson says about them is absolutely true. I think by international standards, these should be core pictures, at least within European and North American art history. There's just no question about that. And of course, they led him, he took them through some 60 paintings or so, and we've seen major installations of them, and it's kind of astonishing how varied and rich they are, not only in the movement of the kind of the lines themselves, but in the when they're shown together, you realize how they are slightly differently hued, and so there's another kind of orchestration that occurs there. He then, I think, felt he exhausted the possibilities that he could work with that without repeating himself, and went into a tailspin. And there's a film by Charles Gagnon, which is, he never finished while he was alive, but it's kind of wonderful, and it focuses on Yves Gaucher somehow trying to break every possible rule that he did in terms of his painting, staining I don't know what he all did, but it's as if he had to work something out of himself, think about everything that he'd done, regather himself, put himself back together again, think about all the pieces that his work of art was about in order to what was essential. And then he came back in the early 70s. And then it's remarkable how he sustained, I think, a really rich career. And did Molinari do that? We could talk about that. Did Tousignan do that? I think maybe he did in another way. But, and it did. I'm sure there were fallow periods when there wasn't much attention being paid, but there were also, over the years, there were kind of regular major exhibitions that celebrated the work. And I think if you could just go back to those, the dark paintings and the pale ones, let's just stay with the pale one, because I like that because it's an installation view. And that gives a much better sense of how these paintings actually feel than when they're simply cropped images. Because you get a sense of the scale, you get a sense of the expansiveness of them. You may even get a little bit of the sense of how they are kind of luminous and how they, and I think that if there's something that differentiates Gaucher from Molinari and from Tousignan, especially from Molinari, is that there's a spiritual aspect to this work. I think Molinari and especially and Tousignan are entirely secular. But by the time you get to these kinds of paintings, it is, he takes, he just, the darker paintings are kind of contemplative, and then he decides to take on all these weird colors and across these huge expanses, and there are how many, there are 4 colors there at least, if not, and somehow they have to be pulled into a unity. They have to be pulled into almost kind of spiritual, mystical oneness, if one is allowed to use vocabulary like that. But since I'm immersed in stuff like that right now, I can't help it. Yeah.
I want to have our audience ask you some questions, but before I do, I have one final question for you both. This is reputed to be Yves Gaucher's final painting, and along the lines that we were just talking about, something that's really struck me about him as a painter and in the publication of this book is that people will constantly say to me, artists will say this, he is a real artist, and they're fascinated by his career. What do you think his most important legacy is to Canadian painting and to Canadian art?
Do you have an answer to that, Adam?
Well, Roald and I had a chat about this. It's not the most upbeat note to end a talk on. No, because I feel like in terms of his legacy, I think that with a lot of, this is generalizing, but a lot of younger painters are maybe not as familiar with the Plasticien or with Canadian painting as it emerged in the years after the Second World War, as I think they ought to be. And I think that comes down to the responsibilities of institutions, Katerina, I'm looking at you, that have collections of this work and haven't made it as accessible, haven't published it, haven't made it. I think it's easier for younger painters to see examples of American art of this period than it is to see examples of great Canadian painting. So I think that part of what you're clearly trying to do here, Sarah, with the ACI is to proselytize and to spread the good news about Canadian painting and the importance of that. And similarly, we're looking to show alternative histories and also to remind a younger generation of the amazing contributions that painters and artists like Gaucher made. So I think his legacy is maybe a little dormant at the moment, although this whole revived interest in zombie formalism might have a.
And I was fascinated to learn that he was Janus Turbeck's teacher.
Oh.
I know. I almost put up the flesh dress, but he was a teacher to many important painters, and that's why I say he to me seems like a real painter's painter in terms of maybe it's the process, the rigor, the deep amount of consideration.
Well, I think the point about the difficulty of actually seeing the work of this generation is very important because they do not make sense in reproduction. They are things to be seen in the flesh in real life. And I was talked to several painters in Canada when I was doing my book on abstract painting who were involved in kind of optical and hard edge abstraction, and they seemed kind of puzzled when I asked them what their relation to this generation was, as yeah, they had seen painting like this elsewhere, but not necessarily on home base. And then I ran into one of them recently. He said, "Oh, now I know what you meant." And I was talking to Janet Jones yesterday, who has a show at Katzman, Cayman Katzman, who yesterday, who is also a hard edge color abstract painter and who studied with Gaucher actually, but she studied printmaking. And that was also kind of, even though there should have been a connection, there wasn't quite the connection is. And I also think, I mean, I can agree more. I think it is the problem of, for whatever reasons, good or bad, our museums are not interested enough in their permanent collections or in the history of Canadian art, and so you can't see anything. And
it's true, although you have a wonderful audience here who clearly has an interest in Yves Gaucher and your work. And so I'd like to throw it to the audience, and if anybody does have a question, we have a few minutes, so don't be shy.
Yeah, it's probably following on from this notion of the reception of Canadian art outside the country. And François-Marc Gagnon made the point that when Bordeaux showed in America, every review read as if he'd never shown there before. And I think that's a huge problem that affected that generation. Perhaps less now, because Canadians now leave in order to have careers. But is this tragic or not?
Is it tragic or not? It's true, because there were, these shows did happen internationally, but the problem tended to be there was no follow-up. So they were in and out, and curators and audiences may have been excited over that for the moment that they were there, but then the exhibition went and something else replaced it. And part of the problem, and I'm thinking of a very different artist, I'm thinking about Ron Martin, who, when I took him in a group show to Europe, caused a lot of excitement. But there was no dealer willing to do the follow-up. So Ron was forgotten, and the moment when he should have been picked up, it didn't happen. I think, of course, things became somewhat easier with photographically based work and conceptual art, where you could almost put it in your suitcase and you could take it with you. But painting was always unique, and painting and sculpture and single heavy objects, and that was always a problem. And we do write it. We bristle, of course, when we try to define what is Canadian art, but art history is written that way. People write nationally. North of the border for the United States is a long ways away. South of the border is no longer a long ways away, because we suddenly have Latin American populations. So somehow we need, and many US museums have come to terms now with post-war abstraction in Argentina and in Venezuela and whatever. They become important, and they're exhibited, and they're part of collections. The Albright Knox has a wonderful op art collection and hard edge painting collection. They have all kinds of concentric circle paintings by Tedeschi, but they don't have a single they don't have a single Tousignant. And the difference, of course, is Tedeschi and the other concentric circle painters that the Albright Knox has a whole bunch of are all figure ground paintings. They're all within the rectangle on a white or otherwise colored ground. So when you see them in reproduction, you think they're Tousignants, because the white of the ground fades into the white of the page of the reproduction. But they're not. They are. They don't even get near that kind of object quality, which is so essential to Montreal painting.
We have time for, I think, one last question. Is it Franklin?
Sure. It's a question about Lismer. When Lismer gave his advice to Gaucher, can you tell anything about what he might already have seen in the man to take the trouble to give him the advice?
No, I don't know that. I think the account is simply that Gaucher walked in or made an appointment, and that Lismer would not have been able to see anything beforehand. This would have been a first encounter.
So it was more a philosophical approach to.
As much, I think, a response to Gaucher the person as to the work. But he obviously must have seen something there if he posed that really tough question.
Okay, I think that was a short question, so we'll take Gerda's question and as our last question for tonight.
You mentioned this mystical dimension in Gaucher, and of course, Barnett Newman, and Rothko also have that dimension, which was so sternly discounted by Clement Greenberg. And we see Rothko in a kind of shrine-like environment in a number of different places. Do you think that we need in Canada to have more single artist or single focus museums that will enable people to enter a mindset that can't easily be assessed when you see, just one or two paintings by someone in an anthology? Do we need an Yves Gaucher shrine somewhere? And is there any basis in the form of an estate, where there would be something where one could have a beautiful modern building concentrated around him and works that are kindred to his within Canadian production?
Well, the moment you enlarge the concept of also contextualizing it, then I think it might be a nice idea. I worry about shrines to individual artists because they, for all kinds of reasons. But on the other hand, when we did the Plasticien show, especially in the Musée de Quebec, where there was a lot more space, we in fact did do a Gaucher shrine to the Gray paintings, and it did it all. It really was exhilaratingly trance-like.
So I think what you're saying, Roald, is look at the art on the internet, see it in the museums. And,
always.
And that really is the goal of the Art Canada Institute, is to look, learn, familiarize through search terms, search engines, online, but then to have that knowledge and experience once one is in an institution. And so with that, I would like to ask you, please, when you do go back to your computers, look at Roald's book, because it's wonderful and it's an extraordinary accomplishment, as are the other ACI titles. And I want to thank you for giving of your time so generously to come out this evening and to hear our speakers. Roald, Adam, thank you for participating in this evening.